It is clear, that the movie represents how things are understood by the realist. For the Pentagon is the movie writ large, as are the KGB or the equivalents thereof throughout history. This is it. Wars under one of the more famous definitions of the reason for war, wars are fought for money and markets. The poor slobs that fight them have no understanding of it. The elites start the wars. The name is greed, power. And so what we have in microcosm in the movie, we have a presentation of the human heart. The human heart that is unwilling to yield. A human heart that is filled with acquisitiveness. A human heart that is trapped in time. For whatever the flower represents has to be gotten now. One has to get all the gusto one can, because one only goes around once. It's trapped in time. And so, this is what we're talking about. Where is the justice? Where is the justice? Who's right? The person on one side of the fence, the person on the other side of the fence? Many years ago, when I was I was at Notre Dame as an undergraduate student, and I did dishes and stuff for the priest and got room and board for it at the seminary. I was not a seminarian. And I remember there was this young fellow who was in the seminary, and in those days, this was the 1950s, in those days, the seminarians used to be down in chapel at 5:45 in the morning for 45 minutes of prayer, most of which was silent prayer. You could do spiritual readings, I remember. But John, this fellow, he had a terrible time staying awake at 5:45 in the morning till 6:30 before Mass. Terrible, terrible time. And the rector used to go around and, as rectors did in those days, or what, would, if he sees someone's head drop off, he'd come walking up the aisle and he'd, grab the person by the ear. It's communication. Well, John had a terrible time. John had a terrible time. And so, one day, John falls so thoroughly asleep between 5:45 and 6:30 that he falls off the pew. That morning in chapel, all hell broke loose. There was a big meeting of rector and rector's committee and disciplinary committee about what to do with John. And finally they called him in, and the rector told him that this couldn't be tolerated. There to pray, you're in the presence of God, you know, and if you can't stay awake in the presence of God, who can you stay awake in the presence of? And that this was his last chance, you know, and so forth and so on. And that this could not be tolerated. It was a bad example to the other seminarians. Huh? A real question mark in terms of whether he had a vocation or not. Disrupting and so forth. And that they had noticed long in the past that he was dozing off now and then. And this was just the culmination of a slack life. And so proper retribution had to be made, and he received, I don't know, whatever the things they did in those days. Yeah. Couldn't leave the seminary for 2 weeks or something. Well, a few months later, after, I guess, a lot of effort, John figured out how to sit in chapel without falling off the pew or any danger of it. How to make it so that his head wouldn't fall. But he still had a difficult time. Difficult time staying awake at that hour in the morning. And so, a few months later, John is sitting there, Rector sitting back, dead silence in the chapel. John is sitting there, apparently meditating, eyes closed, meditating. Not head going down, not falling off the pew, just very straight. And he starts talking to himself in his sleep. So in the middle of this holy silence, there's this voice talking about something or another. Humbling. The rector arises with all the wrath that's available to a man of God under those circumstances. And flies up the aisle and grabs John by the ear and tells him, leave the chapel and go to bed and see him. And of course, there was another great meeting of those who were in charge of formation and so forth, a future priest of the church. And as I remember what happened, they did leave him in, but told him that he could not be a priest in the academic line, that he had to become a missionary or something like that. Lenin says there cannot be a revolution without a theory of revolution. There cannot be a revolution without a theory of revolution. That's true. Huh? You have to be implementing a vision. In order to know the means that you are supposed to be choosing, you have to have the theory that you're working with, the theory of revolution. Byzantine spirituality. There is a famous story about Abbot Peumen, who was the abbot of a monastery in the 5th century. And to show you how things don't change, Abbot Peumen, as the story goes, had the same problem, monks falling asleep during prayer. That's 1,500 years ago. And as the story reads, when Abbot Peumen saw a monk falling asleep during prayer, he said, "When I see a brother going to sleep at divine office, I go to him and I place his head on my knee so that he can sleep peacefully." There is a theory of revolution involved there. There is a theory of life involved there. And it is not the theory of life that's involved in the first story. There is an understanding of Christ, of God, the nature of God, what human life is all about in both stories. And they are not the same, and they are not compatible. There is an understanding about evil and how to respond to it, about human limitations, and they are not the same. Neighbors is a microcosm of war. You know that, I know that. It is a microcosm of the reality. And it is blessed, canonized, baptized, and approved by the church for the last 1,700 years. Those faces represent a spirit. And they are the faces of war and violence, faces of evil acting in the universe. My judgment is they are not the images, the faces, the icons of Christ. Looking at those faces, who would say, here is Christ. Here is the Spirit of Christ. There is a different theory of Christianity, a different theory of revolution between nonviolence and the world of justified violence. They simply are not the same. We all know there can be no nonviolence, where there is acquisitiveness. To go back to lecture 1, I cannot defend or procure by nonviolence that which is luxury when people don't have the necessities of life. There is a theory of revolution in Christian poverty. There is a theory of Christianity in evangelical poverty, and it goes hand in glove with the nonviolence. And there is a theory of revolution, or a theory of Christianity, a theory of life, that is manifest and acted out in the acquisition of wealth and power and in the justification of violence. But they are not the same. They are as different as the Abbot Payman story versus the story of John the seminarian. We are not talking about the same reality. We may be using the same terminology, Christian terminology. It's utterly different. To the person who faces those faces, to the man, the woman, and the child in war, that comes up against that face of anger and hatred and viciousness, to that person, does it really make any difference whether that face is justified by Christ, by Mohammed, by Moses? To the dead and to the maimed, what difference does it make if it's done in the name of capitalism or democracy or communism or socialism? For the reality is the same. The faces of war are the same. And they are not the faces that one finds if one is going about existence with a theory of Christianity that may be called the knee on the head theory of Christianity. Head on the knee theory of Christianity. It's different. pity for suffering humanity, mercy for suffering humanity, because God is merciful and pities suffering humanity, is different. Is different. It's a different approach. One would do it because one believed it was the power of God. Indeed, because one believed only mercy and pity and love and compassion is the power of God. And that there is only power for more destruction in those faces. And in the spirit that they represent, the invisible side that they represent. For we are visible icons always of an invisible reality. Those faces represent what the internal disposition is. Do they represent the Spirit of Christ, the Holy Spirit of Jesus Christ? The Spirit that manifests itself in the fruits of love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, according to Galatians 5. Do they represent the meek and humble of heart? But they represent war for sure. War 1,000,000,000 times over. For behind all the anthems and all the songs and all the money and all the flags and all the politicians and parades, those faces exist. And behind those faces is a spirit. And it is not the spirit of the head on the knee theory of approaching evil. It is not the spirit of mercy and love and compassion. I think we can see the difference in the movies, and a difference as it exists in real life. Difference in terms of the understanding of the gospel, difference in terms of relationships to things, difference in terms of the spirit that's internal. They are not the same. It is not the same theory of revolution. It is not the same understanding of Christianity. It is not the same life. It is not the same truth. The question over here about how dark things look in terms of people living Christ's way of love, people knowing that God is love, is true. True. The way of love is more or less unknown. Look at your average television show and ask yourself, which way does conflict get resolved? Which movie? Do the meek inherit the earth, or do the cruel, the violent, the tough? Do the gentle and the patient and the kind, the good? The very name of the movie, clown. Fool. The dog's clown, huh? But in a world where you only go around once and you've got to get all the gusto you can, it's clown. Fool. We search for God, and yet, if we were to be honest with ourselves, we are lost at the first step by the method we're using. God is not found. Agnosticism, operational atheism, dread, angst, fear, govern, rule, reign. Not the God of love. Not a knowledge of the God of love. Not a burning desire to live as an instrument, as a manifestation, as a magnification, to live to the glory of the God that is love. Agnosticism at best, atheism at worst. Thomas Merton says, to reach the God that you do not know, you must go by a way you do not know. To reach the God that you do not know, you must go by a way that you do not know. The reality is that the God who is a God of love, the God who is incarnate, made flesh, embodied in the person of Jesus, is a God that the world finds useless, utterly and completely useless. For the God who is the God of unconditional love and everlasting mercy is not helpful to nation states or any subdivision thereof. It is a useless God. Merton. We are not supposed to do anything, but rather, if we will just open ourselves to be the person God calls us to be, and to be with the person God, with the persons God calls us to be with, that is enough. God is beyond pragmatic function. God is useless. Yet, by that fact, God does all things. And since we are like God in the depths of our souls, we too are useless. We are as useless as children are useless. We are as useless as sunsets are useless. We are as useless as the simple recognition of a joyful song is useless. Death is useless also. And so is the simple glance of love useless. All that is of ultimate value to the human being, beauty, love, holiness, all are useless. That is, useless to the state, useless to the economy, useless to all that is referred to as flesh in the gospel, which does not mean body. Useless. Clown. Useless, useless, useless. Did you ever see anything so useless? To reach the God you do not know you must go by a way that you do not know. There's no simpler way of saying it. We do not know the God that is everlasting love, unconditional mercy. And therefore, if we are going to reach that God, we are not going to reach that God by going through the tried and true methods that have brought us to a God of fear. You search for God, yet at the first step you are lost. That should be sign enough that the search should be conducted in a different way. And so, there cannot be a revolution without a theory of revolution. The gospel, it seems to me, is the embodiment, the proclamation of the most revolutionary of all concepts. God is unconditional love. And we are made in God's image and likeness. To be what we are supposed to be, we are to be magnifications of that by incarnating unconditional love and never-ending mercy in the face of a world filled with death and evil. We are to do that in the context of the persons God calls us to be with. It is useless by the standards of the state and all the sub-institutions of the state, including the church, to the extent that the church has simply become the religious legitimatizer of what the state is about. Nonviolence understands the second movie, Clown, is the manifestation of the spirit that is absolutely necessary to approach life in, if there is to be any nonviolence. The first movie, Neighbors, is the antithesis of nonviolence. You want the flower? Forget nonviolence. We often say that nonviolence is unnatural. Gandhi says, if love is not the root of our being, there can be no nonviolence. Scripture says we are made in the image and likeness of God, and God is love. We are love at the root of our being. Is nonviolence unnatural, or is it unnurtured? For if it is unnatural, it is impossible. If it is merely unnurtured, it simply requires conversion. Is the love that is talked about nonviolent love that is a manifestation of a God of nonviolent love, knowing that nonviolent love is a redundancy? Is that something that's unnatural to people? Or is it something that they simply haven't been nurtured in? St. John of the Cross, and I'll conclude with this. St. John of the Cross says, each one walks upon a path with no other light or guide than the love that burns within his or her own heart. Each one walks upon a path with no other guide, with no other light or guide than the love that burns within his or her own heart. What is it? Who is it that we love? For what we love is our God. It is what we give our time to. It is what we give our lives over to. It is that creates the logical network of obligations and choices and nothing else. What or who is it that we love in truth? The first step, as I said this afternoon, in the process of discernment is getting straight what or who it is that we love so much that it governs our lives. Do we love mercy or do we love money? Do we love to love or do we love to acquire? Do we love a God who is love, or do we just fear? To reach the God you do not know, you must go by a way that you do not know. Does it seem reasonable that one is going to reach the God of mercy through possessiveness? That one is going to reach the God of love through fear? John of the Cross, you know, I know the truth. We walk upon a path, each one walks upon a path with no other light or guide than the love that burns within his or her own heart. There is nothing else. You know what? For 22 years, the church, and by the church I mean the entire church, from popes to family, fooled me about what was worthy of love. They told me the Marine Corps was, and all that that represented. And that governed, that spirit that manifests itself in the Marine Corps, governed my life under the name of Christianity. That was the light, if you will, the guide. That burned in my heart. For that's all I had to work with. That, and a God, if I played the game right, was going to be good to me. If I didn't, it was going to be disastrous. 22 years of total Christian community, consistently communicating a God of fear and a life of violence as Christian. And how much of that's going on in the church right at this moment in time? Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, you name it. What John of the Cross is ultimately talking about, if you read the whole passage, is when he says, "Each walks upon a path with no other light or guide than the love that burns within his or her own heart." What John of the Cross is talking about is what is at the root of the human heart is a love that is God and that loves each one passionately, personally, and forever. Let that be one's guide. And life will become different for oneself and for all those one comes in contact with. Although, from the point of view of the world, one might be called a fool or a clown.